Trump declared total and complete victory. Iran's Supreme National Security Council declared a great victory. The U.S. Defense Secretary said it was a capital V military victory. And Iran's military said the country forced the United States to accept its proposed conditions and surrender. Both sides stood in front of cameras on the same day claiming they had won the same war. That alone should tell you that something very unusual happened here. Because when two sides both claim victory after the same ceasefire, the question worth asking is not who won. The question worth asking is what actually changed. And the answer to that question will genuinely surprise you. To understand what Iran believes it achieved, you first have to understand what happened in the opening seconds of this war and why Israel and the US went to such extraordinary lengths to keep it secret until the very last moment. 4 months before February 28, 2026, Israeli intelligence conducted what IDF spokesperson Brigadier General Efi Defrin described as months of joint US and Israeli strategic and operational deception of satellite imagery. The deception was meticulous. Warplanes were kept unarmed. Facilities were kept deliberately understaffed in their visual presentation to surveillance systems. On the night of the strike, IDF Chief of Staff Lieutenant General Eyal Zamir and Defrin himself drove their official cars home from IDF headquarters and returned without them so that satellite imagery would show nothing unusual at the base. No preparation. No mobilization. Nothing. Then at 1:15 in the morning of February 28 the operation began. 3 separate locations where senior Iranian regime officials had gathered were struck within half a minute of each other. Not half an hour. Half a minute. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was killed in the first wave. Iranian Defense Minister Aziz Naserzadeh was killed. IRGC Commander Mohammad Pakpour was killed. Chief of Staff Lieutenant General Abdurrahim Mousavi was killed. Defense Council Secretary Ali Shamkhani was killed. 4 top Ministry of Intelligence officials were killed. 7 senior security leaders confirmed dead before the first morning news cycle had even begun. In 20 minutes of the opening operation, the entire command architecture that Iran had spent 40 years building was functionally decapitated. The invisible operation had done what no amount of open military pressure had managed to achieve across 4 decades of shadow conflict. The scale of what Iran absorbed militarily between February 28 and April 7, 2026 is almost incomprehensible when laid out in sequence. The Center for Strategic and International Studies published an assessment that serves as the most authoritative independent accounting of what actually happened. By the time the ceasefire was announced, Iran had lost its supreme leader, its military high command, its integrated air defense network, its naval capacity, its ballistic missile launch infrastructure, and its nuclear facility operational status. The Iranian government assessed damage to its own economy at between $300 billion and $1 trillion. At least 276 people died in the strikes on Iran alone. Thousands more were killed across the region. Trump said just about everything has been knocked out. Size confirmed that Iran, not a strong military power before the war, is now far weaker. The war represented the biggest oil supply disruption since the 1970s energy crisis. By every conventional military metric, Iran was devastated. And yet Iran's Supreme National Security Council issued a statement saying good news to the dear nation of Iran. Nearly all the objectives of the war have been achieved. How do you read that statement when your supreme leader is dead, your navy is gone, your air defenses are destroyed, and your economy has absorbed a potential trillion-dollar blow? The answer to that question is the invisible operation that nobody is talking about. Here is what the military assessments consistently undercount and what Iran understood from the very first day of the war. The Strait of Hormuz is 34 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. Through that 34-kilometer passage flows approximately 20% of all global seaborne oil trade and 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas. Every day before the war, roughly 20 million barrels of oil passed through that choke point. Saudi Arabia's exports. UAE's exports. Iraq's exports. Qatar's enormous LNG shipments to Europe and Asia. All of it. funneled through a waterway where Iranian territory forms the northern shore and where Iran's coastal defense capacity had been deliberately preserved even as its conventional military was being dismantled. Closing the Strait of Hormuz required no functioning air force. It required no navy. It required no ballistic missiles. It required no air defense system. It required Iranian coastal defense forces on Iranian territory to make clear that ships attempting to transit without permission would face consequences. And it required the willingness to absorb the response. Iran closed the strait on March 2, the second full day of the war. Commercial vessel traffic fell by 95% compared to pre-war levels according to the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. Nearly 2,000 vessels were stranded on both sides of the strait waiting for clearance. Global oil prices surged to levels not seen in years. The International Energy Agency described it as the biggest shock to the global energy industry in history. The 32 member nations of the IEA released 400 million barrels of emergency oil reserves in an attempt to stabilize prices. It was not enough. Trump had threatened Iran would be destroyed. But Iran had already closed the valve on the global economy and the pain was being felt in every country on earth that imports energy. That leverage did not depend on any of the military capabilities that the US and Israel had just spent 5 weeks destroying. What happened next is the part that changes the entire framing of who won this war. Rather than simply closing the Strait of Hormuz and holding it as a hostile act, Iran transformed its control into a revenue model. The IRGC established what Lloyd's List intelligence described in formal maritime reporting as a de facto toll booth regime. Ships seeking to transit the strait were required to submit full documentation to IRGC Navy Hormuzgan Provincial Command for what Iran called sanctions screening and geopolitical vetting. Ships that passed the vetting received clearance codes and were escorted by IRGC vessels through a single controlled corridor running close to Larak Island off the coast of Bandar Abbas. Ships from Malaysia, China, Egypt, South Korea and India were among those allowed passage after their governments entered direct diplomatic negotiations with Tehran. The numbers behind this arrangement reveal why Iran's political leadership could plausibly frame this as a victory even amid catastrophic military losses. Analysts at Foreign Policy calculated that even a modest transit fee of $500,000 per vessel applied to the 2,600 monthly transits of normal strait traffic would generate more than $1.5 billion per month. Iran's parliament moved to pass legislation formalizing toll collection. Iranian officials insisted that maintaining oversight and control over the Strait of Hormuz and collecting fees for services related to security, safety and environmental protection was a legitimate and permanent Iranian right. Think about what this means in strategic terms. Iran entered this war with a military that the US and Israel destroyed in 5 weeks. Iran emerged from those 5 weeks with a new institutional claim over the world's most important oil shipping choke point. The claim is legally contested under international maritime law. But the physical capacity to enforce it exists and has been demonstrated. Ships were paying. Countries were negotiating bilaterally with Tehran for access. The IRGC was operating an escort service through a corridor in Iranian territorial waters. Iran did not just survive the war. It created a revenue model out of the war. When Iran submitted its 10-point proposal that Trump called a workable basis for negotiation, the list of demands made clear exactly what Tehran believed it had earned through the conflict. Iran demanded the lifting of all international sanctions and the release of all frozen Iranian assets held overseas. It demanded compensation and reparations for war damages. It demanded the withdrawal of US combat forces from military bases across the region. It demanded an end to all hostilities against the axis of resistance, including Hezbollah, Hamas and the Houthis. It demanded international recognition of Iran's right to nuclear enrichment. It demanded that Iran maintain oversight and control over the Strait of Hormuz. And it demanded a binding UN Security Council resolution to secure any final agreement. Several of those demands represent fundamental changes to the entire post-Cold War Middle Eastern security architecture. Withdrawal of US forces from regional bases. International recognition of Iranian authority over the Strait of Hormuz. The right to nuclear enrichment. These are not negotiating positions designed to be traded away. These are strategic objectives that Iran has pursued for decades and which it now believes the military and economic leverage created by the war gives it the credibility to demand at a formal negotiating table. Iran's Supreme National Security Council described the ceasefire as forcing the United States to accept the general framework of Iran's 10-point proposal as a basis for talks. It called the ceasefire an enduring defeat for Washington. It said nearly all the objectives of the war have been achieved. That language is not diplomatic spin. It reflects a genuine reading of what Iran believes it extracted from a conflict in which its military was comprehensively degraded. Understanding why Iran can simultaneously absorb catastrophic military losses and claim strategic victory requires understanding the difference between tactical military outcomes and strategic political outcomes. The US and Israel define success in traditional military terms. Destroy the nuclear program. Degrade the missile arsenal. Eliminate the military leadership. Achieve air dominance. These objectives were substantially achieved. Iran's conventional military capacity was severely reduced. Its nuclear program was disrupted. Its supreme leader and most of its senior military commanders are dead. But Iran defined success in different terms. The regime survived. Iran as a nation was not conquered. No foreign forces set foot on Iranian soil. The Islamic Republic remained the governing authority. And Iran emerged from the conflict having demonstrated something no previous crisis had allowed it to demonstrate at this scale. That it could hold the global energy supply hostage and extract payments from major world powers in exchange for allowing their ships to pass through a waterway that international law says is open to all. Size analysts describe the core analytical difficulty this way. It is difficult to tell which side is winning in the US-Israeli war with Iran because the objectives and strategies for victory of the combatants are so different. That difficulty is not a failure of analysis. It is the precise description of what happened. Two sides fought the same war for completely different objectives and both achieved a meaningful portion of what they were pursuing. The US and Israel achieved military dominance and degraded Iran's capacity to threaten them with missiles, drones, and nuclear ambiguity. Iran achieved the survival of its regime, the demonstration of its geographic leverage over the global energy supply, and a seat at a negotiating table where it is presenting demands that would have been unthinkable a year ago. The most consequential long-term outcome of this war may not be anything that happened in Iranian airspace. It may be what happened in the Strait of Hormuz. Iran established that a country facing the full weight of American and Israeli military power could survive that pressure long enough to transform a geographic choke point into a revenue stream. That precedent did not escape the attention of other countries watching from the outside. Reza Khanzada, a professor of Middle East politics at George Mason University, told TRT World that Iran is trying to establish a precedent that could be replicated by allies in other contested waterways such as the South China Sea. That observation matters enormously. The Strait of Hormuz is not the only choke point in the global maritime system. The Strait of Malacca, through which roughly 40% of global trade passes. The Taiwan Strait. The Bab el-Mandeb connecting the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden. If a country can successfully operate a toll booth in Hormuz under US military pressure, the template for applying that model to other choke points becomes more credible everywhere. The legal framework under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea explicitly prohibits coastal states from imposing charges on vessels merely for transit passage through international straits. Iran's position is that wartime conditions cannot be governed by peacetime rules. That argument does not hold under international maritime law according to experts including Shola Ali, a professor of law at the University of Hong Kong, who stated that Iran has no legal authority to impose blanket transit tolls on vessels. But legal authority and practical capacity are two different things. Iran collected fees in Chinese yuan brokered by Chinese maritime intermediaries. The transactions happened. The precedent was set. The 2-week ceasefire was supposed to create space for the Islamabad talks to produce a framework for a permanent agreement. Those talks took place on April 10 and 11 under Pakistani mediation with Vice President J.D. Vance leading the U.S. delegation. They failed. The failure centered on several issues that were never going to be resolved in 2 weeks of negotiations under the shadow of an unresolved military situation. Iran's nuclear program and its insistence on the right to enrichment. Its support for Hezbollah, Hamas and the Houthis, which the U.S. regards as terrorist organizations. The question of U.S. troop withdrawals from regional bases. And the Hormuz question, which Iran was refusing to simply hand back as if the previous 6 weeks had not happened. Following the failure of the Islamabad talks, Trump announced that the U.S. Navy would blockade the strait from April 13 to clear it of mines and restore freedom of navigation. 23 ships were forced to turn around by U.S. naval forces in the Gulf of Oman. Iran responded by closing the strait again. The cycle that the ceasefire was supposed to break resumed almost immediately. Iran's position going into and coming out of those talks reflects exactly the invisible victory logic. Iran's Supreme National Security Council said it would maintain oversight and control over the Strait of Hormuz and collect transit fees. Its negotiating team arrived in Islamabad not as a defeated party seeking terms but as a country that believes it holds a permanent geographic asset that cannot be bombed away. The regime survived. The geography did not change. The leverage did not disappear with the ceasefire announcement. And Iran knows that as long as those 3 facts remain true, the negotiating dynamic looks very different from a conventional military assessment of who won and who lost. Both sides claiming victory in the same conflict does not make both sides correct. It does not make anyone a winner in any meaningful human sense. And the human accounting of what this war produced deserves its own honest assessment. At least 76 people died in U.S. and Israeli strikes on Iran. More than 1,500 people were killed in Lebanon. 3 U.S. service members were killed in the first days of the war. The Iranian government's own estimate of economic damage to its country ranges between $300 billion and $1 trillion. Thousands of Iranians lost family members in a conflict that killed the supreme leader, a man who had governed for decades within a household whose extended family also died in that opening strike. The damage to Iran's medical infrastructure was severe. The World Health Organization identified 13 Iranian health infrastructure sites that were struck in the first week of the war alone. The Pasteur Institute, a century-old medical research center, sustained major damage. A girls' school in southern Iran was struck. The highest bridge between Tehran and Karaj was destroyed while families celebrated a national holiday in the parks below. 8 people died when it collapsed. 95 were wounded. The economic ripple effects were not confined to Iran. The Strait of Hormuz crisis was the biggest supply shock to the global energy industry since the 1970s oil embargo. Fertilizer prices surged because roughly 30 to 35% of global urea exports and 20 to 30% of global ammonia exports normally transit the strait. Supply chains across Asia were disrupted. Airlines rerouted. Energy costs rose across every importing country. The people paying those higher prices had nothing to do with starting this war. Iran's Supreme National Security Council says nearly all the objectives of the war have been achieved. Trump says total and complete victory. Size says it is difficult to tell which side is winning because the objectives are so different. But there is a question that neither victory claim can answer. What happens to Iran's nuclear program now? Secretary of State Marco Rubio stated that the U.S. 15-point plan makes clear Iran can never have nuclear weapons. Trump stated on April 8 that there will be no enrichment of uranium and that the United States will work with Iran to remove all deeply buried nuclear material. Iran's 10-point proposal included acceptance of enrichment as a non-negotiable right. These two positions did not move closer together in Islamabad. They remain as far apart as they were before the war began. Aaron David Miller, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and former Middle East advisor to both Republican and Democratic administrations, put the core strategic problem plainly. Iran's stocks of highly enriched uranium remain under Iranian control. That is a cornerstone of Iran's nuclear weapons ambitions, and the US has not resolved it. That unresolved reality is the thread connecting the military campaign, the ceasefire, the toll booth, and the failed Islamabad talks. The war was in significant part fought over the nuclear question. The nuclear question was not resolved. Size made the assessment that Iran can rebuild its missile and other weapons programs after the shooting stops because Iran has enough human capital to resume work. That assessment, combined with the Hormuz toll booth model and the survival of the regime, paints a picture that does not match either side's victory narrative. Iran is weaker than it was on February 27. Iran is not strategically neutralized. And Iran has demonstrated in real time that it can absorb devastating conventional military pressure and still operate the geographic leverage that makes it a central factor in global energy security. The operation that redrew the map in 20 minutes on February 28 was visible to the world. B-2 bombers. Tomahawk missiles. Precision strikes on leadership compounds. The decapitation of an entire military command structure before dawn. But the invisible operation that may matter more happened over 5 weeks and did not require a single stealth aircraft. It required Iran to hold one geographical position and extract from that position a new set of facts on the ground that no military campaign can simply erase. The Strait of Hormuz before February 28, 2026 was an international waterway through which ships passed according to international law. The Strait of Hormuz after the ceasefire is a waterway where Iran's IRGC has established an escort corridor, charged fees in foreign currency, and created a political and institutional framework for ongoing control that Iran intends to make permanent regardless of what any peace agreement says. That is the invisible operation. Not the one involving stealth bombers flying from Missouri. The one involving an IRGC naval commander on Larak Island telling a container ship it needs a clearance code before proceeding.